Hello there. I'm Jeff Nugent, and welcome to another episode of Ask the Expert on Contingent Workforce Strategies LinkedIn Group. I've got a great topic today and a great guest from Innovative Employee Solutions. And the topic today is items that you often overlook when hiring globally. And I'm joined today by Helga Venturini Townend from IES. And I'm so excited to talk about this topic. It's kind of near and dear to my heart as a kind of geek in the employer of record, agent of record space, especially on a global basis. So Helga, thank you for joining us from jolly old England.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me.
So, give me a little bit about your background in the employer of record space and, how did you get into this business?
Right. Well, to be honest, it was just by accident, really. I was living in Italy at the time and literally got recruited at the supermarket in the little town where I was living at the time. So there you go. That's how it all started back in 2000. So I have worked for a few companies in terms of employer of record. I have worked for recruitment agencies, MSP providers. I had my own business. So yeah, there you go. I've been around for a little while. So
It is. We all kind of bump into this industry by happenstance, right? And then you get
I
really
think so.
passionate about it.
I
So
think
it's really
so.
cool. So, this topic of hiring globally has really gotten momentum. And it was always an important topic, as contingent programs or, companies started to look at their global programs and they'd come to experts abroad to help them navigate employment laws, etc. But really, it's the remote work and because brought on by the pandemic, that's really allowed companies to hire globally and hire the talent they need globally. And so you're seeing more and more, you know, companies hiring people and the talent they need to do work wherever they live, right? And so the the need to ensure compliance is so important. And so, it's always interesting, and I'm a Canadian and you're in the UK, and we work often with large multinational or US multinationals, right? And so working with large US multinationals, they tend to have a perspective of the US and some of the employment and tax laws within the US market. But once you venture outside of that space, things can drastically become different, And so, can you kind of give some thoughts to things to think about and the differences between employment standards laws in the US versus, say, Europe, in the European, different countries in Europe?
Yeah, of course. Right. Yeah, I think the ability to hire internationally and to be able to recruit anybody anywhere, it has been there, but as you said, it has really been sped up by the pandemic. And I think what companies have found is that not only they're looking for contingent workers and temporary engagements, but sometimes even hiring somebody on a more permanent basis as well. And that's where a NEO will be able to support them. But indeed, as you say, it's the differences, right, that you have between what you're used to, especially for American companies. Fair enough, they do have enough to contend with in terms of the different state legislation and how things vary from state to state. But then, yeah, you go outside the US and it is a completely different world. I suppose, especially for US companies, you have challenges when it comes to some basic concepts. In the US, you would have the employment at will. So it's easier to hire, but then to dismiss people. Now, when you come specifically to Europe, which you just mentioned, It is very different. There are very specific pieces of legislation that have been put in place to protect temporary workers, and to make sure that these contingent workers and people being hired for specific projects, that they're not being treated less favorably than they would be had they been engaged directly by the end client, right? The end hire.
Yeah.
And that's where there can be a little bit of a cultural shock, because in the US, it's easy to hire somebody. You don't necessarily, in many states, you don't necessarily have to worry about the payments of holidays and providing a number of benefits. When you come to Europe, it's very different, because these temporary workers, contingent workers, again, they have to be treated like any other normal employee. So they will have entitlements in terms of paid holidays. Many countries do have paid sick leave, and you have a number of other things, including protection against dismissal.
Yeah, well, and it was always fascinating, not fascinating, but also surprising for a lot of American clients and North American clients, when you start thinking about 13th and 14th salary, which in general terms, that's vacation pay, right? But when you're adding 20-25% just for vacation pay, it is a sticker shock when it comes to pricing. And so it's really important to start to think about some of these things and be prepared for it, because often globally, you hire globally and the rate may seem cheaper than in North America, but because when you add in some of these additional costs, or you have to accrue for, like you say, the severance and termination pay, that is often quite heavy. That adds to the prices, the pricing, and the bill rates, right? That have to be accrued into it. So it's often shocking when you first think about it, when you have a pay rate here, but the bill rate is a jump, even though it's all either paid to the worker or paid to the government often as well, right?
Indeed. And again, it is because these people are treated, they have to be treated as the majority of all the employees. So any statutory benefits, and that will include contributions to even private pensions, which is something we have had in the UK for a while now. Ireland has been looking into implementing that, and you have a number of social security contributions that form part of that employer burden. And then you have the holidays. Many countries, as you were saying, you have the 13th, the 14th. Italy, depending on the sector you're working, you could get up to a 16th salary. So it is a massive difference when you have to consider all these extra costs and these extra benefits. And yeah, I think that's why it's so important for the client and whoever they are partnering with to have that very close relationship and be able to work in true partnership and make sure that the education process is just taking place all the time, that there is always discussion, and that there's never an assumption that you have understood. I don't think there's ever a silly question, right? Sometimes people feel that it may not be ideal to ask because they should have known, but it's not a good risk to take, especially when it comes to employing and engaging people abroad, because terms can mean different things as well.
So the other thing too, I know we talked about the differences between hiring. There are some differences between hiring full-time employees and contingent workers. But one of the things I think you also have to understand is there's licensing around the difference. So you might be a traditional employer, but if you're having to hire a contingent worker, the employers that are the employer of records of third parties that are you're working with have to have certain licensing requirements as well. So, that's always something that might be important to ask of your vendor community as you're looking to go global. Um, and what happens if you are not working with a licensed agency?
Well, that could result in some messy business, really. Many of the countries where you do have a need for a license, let's say, whether that's the labor leasing license you have in Germany, right? Or the license you can get in Italy, or the specific approvals that you need in France, and so on, whether you're operating as a staffing company or as a portage salarial. There are so many nuances and requirements in terms of what a provider needs to do. So it's really important for the client to understand and have I would say, a robust due diligence process to understand how is this entity set up? What type of solution are they providing? Are they really compliant in country? Because compliance is a word I suppose everybody loves, right? And it's nice to say, yes,
It's also
absolutely.
just a word. I'm
Yeah,
compliant. We're
yeah,
compliant.
I'm
Of course we're
compliant.
compliant, right? Until you get
Exactly.
caught.
Exactly. And that's the thing. It's important for the client to understand, are they really working with a party that understands and operates in line with the local legislation? I fully appreciate there are a number of grey areas. There are some countries where it may be slightly less black and white as to whether you really need a license or not to operate. But what's relevant for clients to know is that if they fail to carry out that due diligence and understand whether they are working with a compliance partner or not, they could end up becoming liable, not only in terms of shared liability, because there's some sort of chain legislation where any monies owed to the local government could maybe be chased from any parties in the chain, but there's also the risk that the clients could end up being seen as the direct employer of that worker. And then you get into areas such as potential permanent establishment issues, where even if it's a US company and they are not necessarily based in the Netherlands, let's say, but they have workers in the Netherlands, and the providers they're working with are not necessarily compliant with Dutch legislation, that could create a whole a whole lot of issues, really, in terms of corporate tax liability and employment legislation breaches that could have taken place, and that US company would have to respond for those. So it's not something to be taken lightly. And again, it's important to ask those questions. Sorry.
So, often too, we're talking about remote work, but there's a whack load of new legislation you're seeing every day. Different countries are putting in legislation around digital nomads, and it comes into labor mobility. So, because of the digital nomad, they're working remote, but they're traveling abroad and working in different locations. There's the traditional, just getting a work visa as well, that you can work in different countries as well, and you see it more so, because of the proximity in Europe. You'll see people migrating back and forth to different countries. You know, what about some of those mobility issues, worker mobility issues that you have to be aware of around immigration or work visas, healthcare, or even taxation of the workers? Really can change from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So can you highlight some of the differences that you've experienced in the different employers that have had workers working abroad and being mobile?
Yeah, absolutely. So, again, we're still talking about the pandemic, right? Even in 2023, but that has changed so much in terms of the world of work, right? And it's something that has got so much accentuated by that, because you had people who maybe had traveled to visit family, and then restrictions were imposed, and people weren't really able to return to the country where they were normally based and would normally work. And from there, obviously, it has just expanded anyway, because of the ability of hiring people in different places. But also, okay, we're in the US, we're hiring people in these other 10 countries, and we just want to have them over for 3 or 4 weeks, and so we can all work together. It's, a very valid thought, right? An intention, and nobody's really wanting to break any immigration rules. But it can be a naive approach, in that you're not really able to just get people to travel to a location and carry out the work they would normally do on a day-to-day basis, just because all you need to work is maybe a laptop, and maybe you still use a mobile. That doesn't mean you can work from anywhere. Yes, you can physically, you can, but there are still different laws that you have to observe. So as you were saying, from a simple immigration point of view, and if we also add to that the right to work. So if so I'm an Italian citizen, right? I'm based in the UK, and I'm a resident in the UK. Fair enough. I could travel to a country. I could travel to the US, maybe for meetings for a week, for business meetings, and that's about it. And obviously, I'll probably do some of my normal work and emails and so on. But what people need to understand is that in doing so, and the longer the person stays in a different country, the more or the higher the risk. Because if somebody simply fancies to, okay, right, I'm normally based in Brazil, but I fancy spending 2 months in France. I have some friends there, and my employer is absolutely okay with me being in France for 2 months. They're even going to allow me to work those different hours because of the time difference. Perfect. However, if you have a Brazilian passport, do you really have the right to work in France? Because that's what you're doing. You are working in France. You're not working for a French entity. Fair enough. I understand that. But legislation does not always develop as quickly as our habits do. Yeah. So a lot of the legislation is still okay. If you go to France and you work for a French company, then you need a work visa that is sponsored by that French company. French legislation might not necessarily have anything that says, right, okay, if you are from a different country, but you just want to come and work here and enjoy the beauties and, the wonders of France, that's okay. It's not like that. It's so much so that so many countries have started implementing the digital nomad visas. And I know it might not be the cleverest argument, but if you think about this, if there weren't, if the need for such a visa wasn't really there. And the digital nomad visa allows you to legally work from that country when you are actually normally a resident of a different place, right? Of a different country. And so that is a way for you to be away from home, for you to work remotely in a legal way. So if it was okay for everybody to travel everywhere and work from everywhere, you wouldn't have these types of visas. And then you have more things, not only the right to work, but you have indeed the potential tax liability that you could be creating for yourself as an individual, for the company that you work for, from a corporate point of view. If anything happens to you, if you need any medical assistance whilst you are in that country, okay, most people would hopefully go for some sort of travel insurance. But if that's not in place, then what happens? And in terms of repatriation, there are so many things that can come out of it. So it's not as innocent as many people assume. So
Yeah.
I know there's a lot in there. So I hope that still makes some sense.
I think that could even be a second episode that we talk about immigration, and the legislation will define often how long they can be in those jurisdictions, where the taxes and payroll taxes need to be paid to, and income tax of the worker to be paid, and like you say, even the healthcare. Often, like we've been seeing in the digital nomad legislation, it's required that they have their own healthcare for coming into the country often as well, so that it's not a burden on the healthcare system while potentially not paying taxes into the system, right?
Absolutely.
So it's very interesting how things are evolving when it comes to the mobility of labor, the work visas, and how it affects the society. It's interesting. A lot of countries are doing the digital nomad to attract people, hoping that they may stay as permanent residents and come in and join the talent pools, right? I think we've seen a lot of writing around that there is a talent shortage, right?
Yeah.
And so bringing people in, hoping that they'll stay, is one of those ways to help the different economies get the talent they need, right? So it's interesting, but like you say, our habits move quicker than legislation often. So it's important to check what the legislation is as you're going abroad into different countries when it comes to work visas and the right to work and how the taxes are paid, etc. Right?
Indeed, yeah. And so many countries, they're doing it for different reasons. So you have the countries that have maybe suffered because of less tourism, but then you have so many countries with aging populations who are desperate for that injection of new talent and foreign talent. And I suppose the digital nomad visa is one of the ways of attracting those.
So, the other, I guess, topic often, and we've not only seen it in movies and, you hear about it, the cultural differences and the terminology usages. As a Canadian traveling to the US quite a bit, I've learned, and to Europe, I've learned different countries call garbage different things, to what they call the bathroom, the loo versus the restroom in America often. So, and I joke about that and oversimplify, but the same goes to employment, cultural differences, the way the terminology, etc. So being aware of that and asking for clarification is probably something very important. What are some of the differences when it comes to things along those cultural differences and language and terminology differences that could cause issues?
Well, I suppose you can look at it in there are different ways really of approaching this, and how you can perceive the differences, because it's not only differences in the way certain terms are interpreted only from country to country, but sometimes even from company to company, right? And but okay, just talking about some examples, I suppose if we say contractor, yeah, the word contractor in the UK, if you say contractor straight away, you would probably think of somebody who's self-employed. So an independent contractor, somebody who maybe works on their own, possibly have their own limited company, and provide services that way. You go to another country and you say contractor, that could simply mean, well, somebody who's working on a temporary basis and they're doing contract work. And the challenge and the risk that you possibly have there is, if the interpretation and the meaning of those terms, if it's different than what you're assuming, you could end up hiring somebody from a different category that you thought you were hiring. So maybe it's actually going to have to be an employee, and you thought you were hiring somebody who was an independent contractor and self-employed. And then when you get maybe a quota, say, well, heck, what's going on here? How come I'm paying employers' costs when I thought I was hiring an independent contractor, or the other way around? And not only that, but you can have the application of legislation that would be different as well. So if you're referring to agency workers in the European meaning of agency workers, so temporary workers, temporary employees who are leased, who are provided to a third party, that would mean something to some clients, and they would maybe understand, okay, I'm going to have to apply equal treatment, and all these things are going to have to take place. But if you say temporary workers to somebody else, they might simply assume, oh, that means they're a temp, therefore we're talking about a clerical type of engagement, maybe a receptionist. And that's not necessarily the same thing. And again, the interpretation and understanding of those terms will certainly affect the pricing, the management of that resource, the type of engagement. Many times it will affect how long you can keep them for, how long they can be supplied to that same client. So again, before I was talking about making sure you ask questions, and that there are no silly questions. It's always worth checking. So if somebody is talking to you and maybe presenting their wonderful solution, make sure you understand all the terms they're using, because it could be that in that specific country, it means something very different to what you're used to.
Yeah, and I've always said that, in compliance, the number one trigger of issues is misunderstandings, right? And disgruntled worker that ends up misunderstanding what they were getting into, and they'll go get an attorney or a legal counsel to represent them. And as opposed to, if you clear the air and make sure everybody understands how the definitions and the terminology works, then it reduces risk, right, for issues or audits, etc. Right?
Yeah, and they can really delay things as well, right? So if you as a client, you think you're hiring somebody as an independent contractor, and actually the provider's working towards offering an employment contract, until you sort all that out, you upset the resource, right? So the talent gets frustrated. The other parties involved, it's a waste of time for everybody. It can actually create liabilities.
Yeah.
So let's say if somebody has been offered a contract of employment in certain countries, that's legally binding, which means you need to go ahead with that employment then. But the client who was going to utilize that resource, they weren't thinking they were getting an employee. They thought they were getting a contractor, an independent contractor, and it was all going to be based on the statement of work. So the confusion, the frustration, the waste of time, the potential liability, the costs that come with it, it can become a bit of a nightmare.
So there's no silly questions, and
Never.
the key is to really have that open, transparent communication with all
Always.
parties, quite honestly, be it the worker to the agency or third party that you're engaging workers through to the client. So,
Always. Yes.
Helga, this has been really enlightening and exciting to have the conversation. I love having these conversations around, working globally because I think it's the way of the future. And so thank you for your time today. It's been amazing.
No, thank you so much for having me. And yeah, it's been lovely. I could talk for a few more hours if you wanted.
I think we'll have some additional content in the near future. Talk soon.
Oh, thank you, Jeff.